האיום הדמוגרפי.
איום ביטחוני.
ביטחוני.
The threat is security. The threat is economic. I think the security threat. I think the polarization in society. I think the economic threat is connected to the social threat. What threat? Economic threat as a result of social threat. And of course, security threat. Only the economic threat. The nuclear threat from Iran. I think the social threat. I think the economic threat is what can destroy.
קודם כיפת ברזל.
קודם כל ביטחון.
תשמע, קודם החיים קודמים לכל דבר.
Life is...
גם זה וגם זה צריך.
We need both. We need to put more money into education. Education. I would divide the money into half for education and half for Iron Dome. Education. 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 Both.
הקולנוע נגמר? כן. אחר צהריים טובים. אנחנו עוברים קצת...
We are moving over now from humanities to sociology,
פחות משעה קרובה.
or the social scientists, and we will devote the next session to a discussion of the security budget. I have with us here is David Brodet, Dr. Adi Brender, and Reem Aminoach. I won't introduce each of the speakers. First of all, it will take a lot of time because they each have a very long CV. And also because you can see it in the booklets that you received and you can read it in your own time. I'd just like to say a few words by way of introduction of this session. It might sound a little provocative. The security budget of the State of Israel, in my opinion, is a success story of extraordinary proportions. When we look around, we see a country that has succeeded using non-conventional methods, I'm sure as people will say, to decrease its security load dramatically and sharply without entering into a crisis as a result and without endangering its existence and without the hostile environment concluding that it can threaten it. And the growth is about 4.5% annually, and the Central Bureau of Statistics talks about the overall cost of security to the Israeli economy. We're still about 6%. These are very important and meaningful numbers, but they are much, much smaller than 10, 20, and 30 years ago. The arguments are basically over 0.5% of the GDP. In terms of shekels, it's a lot of money, but in terms of the overall economy, it's not. And the discussion about Israel's economy doesn't start or end with a discussion of the security budget. That's what I wanted to say, and I will give the floor to David Brodet of the well-known Brodet Committee, or Task Force. You can speak from the podium if you like, or seated, whatever you like. Good day to everyone. Although we are going to talk about the security budget, but I'm not going to mention numbers, hardly at all. I would like to talk about dilemmas and insights that I have acquired in my years of work on the economy and budgets. And I'd like to say how I see things these days, and these are more generic in regard to the subject of the security budget. First of all, there's no such thing as saying there is a correct, scientifically objective budget for the State of Israel, just as you can't say that about any other country. And I will say something economic to explain why this subject of setting a security budget is so problematic. We, the security budget is a public product, unlike other things that are private budget. So security is public and it is collectively consumed by the public together. There's no such thing as saying you use this much of the budget, you use that much of the budget. We all use the budget and consume the budget collectively in an identical fashion, more or less. And so this public product is defined by us economists. There is no market mechanism that can say what is the right budget. We can measure it. We can measure its cost more or less. And the moderator already talked about the proportion of the budget, and I don't want to get into this specific aspect of the discussion. In other words, we can measure the cost of the security budget to the Israeli economy, and once it was much higher in relative terms than it is today. What can we not measure? We cannot measure. We can measure its cost. We cannot measure its effectiveness. We define effectiveness, and I'd like you to pay attention to this definition of mine in the and this explains the difficulty in understanding the cost benefit of it. The benefit or effectiveness of the security budget is to prevent an event that should not actually happen in the future. That's our goal, to prevent an event and prevent it from happening in the future. And in other words, we need to prevent an event from happening in the future at a probability which I cannot measure. In other words, I don't know what the event is, I don't know what the size of the event that I'm preventing is, and I don't know what the probability that it will occur is. And so preventing a war, which is a major event, I cannot tell you what is the probability of preventing a war that the right security budget will do in the most optimal fashion. So what we have is a kind of lack of symmetry. We can measure cost, but we cannot measure effectiveness, and this is the reason for the difficulty in much of the public discussions and debates that we hold. It's a little bit different from other public products like education, for example, but there it's easier to measure the effectiveness than in securities, in conceptual terms, without getting into the details. What we know as a fact is that Israel's geopolitical situation is difficult. That's why we need a large security budget. Another thing we know is that this is not a one-time event. It is an ongoing event throughout the existence of the state. It's not like the Second World War, that for 6 years the whole world was enlisted. Here we're talking in terms of many, many years. As a result of this, a certain budget is determined. We had a committee. We tried to determine a budget. If we set a budget that is too high in terms of its effectiveness, we will cause damage to the economy in terms of the fact that we will direct less to other resources. This happened in the years after the Yom Kippur War and what is known as the lost decade. There, the rate of the defense cost reached 30% in the years 75, 76, and 77. And then it went down to 20-25%. In other words, we exaggerated in our security spending. I'm not sure if the understanding of the effectiveness was correct, but we caused damage to the Israeli economy immediately and in the long term. But if the security budget is too low, we will damage the security. That hasn't yet happened. There have been claims, but it hasn't actually happened yet, at least not on the ground. And so measuring the security spending is not divorced from other subjects, such as the ability to allocate resources to security and to the economy if we spend too much on the security, but it is also a function of the political side, in other words, not only of the economic side and social side. From the political aspect, I can say that although the IDF has a security doctrine, no one can replace either at the responsibility and wisdom of the statesman. Their responsibility and wisdom can determine the meaning of the effectiveness in terms of preventing the damage caused by an event that didn't happen and changing the probability that such an event will happen. In other words, the effectiveness that I want to draw from the security budget, it has a direct political impact on the effectiveness and therefore on the cost. And the committee that I headed, which was very distinguished in terms of its members 7-8 years ago, we tried to formulate all these ideas in a different way. And what we did in the committee was as follows. To assess the size of this, or the magnitude of this event that I don't want to happen, to assess its probability, we determined that we want to lower the proportion of the security spending from the GDP. We heard now that it's 6 or 7% of the GDP, which are the figures from the last year. This is already lower than the opening figures of the committee, and this was part of what we wanted to do, but lower it by some percentage points. And we wanted to increase, and there was a drop. We wanted to increase the civilian spending by 2.8 as compared to 1.3 for security. And we internalized in terms of the fact that we said in our recommendations to the politicians, you have responsibility in this area of political responsibility and if impacting the security budget. But what's more important, we determined a multi-year budget that would make it possible to have an effective multi-year program for the security system. We succeeded for one 5-year period and not so much for the second 5-year period. We determined certain rules of the game, as we thought, between the security establishment and the finance ministry. We weren't so successful there. And we said that certain things could not be touched. I don't know if that was actually done, but we did determine we didn't give the security system the freedom to do so. It must come from the government. And another thing, we determined parameters of streamlining. Although the IDF is all in all a very effective machine, especially the fighting side, and also, but there's still things that can be done in all areas. And this, I think, in this area of streamlining, was stepped up a bit, if not at the start, at least in recent years. And I would like to emphasize, without any connection to the fact of whether the security budget is 50, 60, or 7, the streamlining is a neutral parameter for any security spending. The subject of streamlining should be implemented and not as a one-time thing, but as on an ongoing basis. As far as insights are concerned, we are unable to come and say, as I said earlier, that there is one truth. As you saw, there is effectiveness, there is preventing things from happening, there is probability, so there are different assessments. And as a result of these different assessments, we have these disagreements that we've heard in the past 7-8 years since the committee, and will continue in the future. I can promise you that. If we're talking about the level of the lower level of security spending, then the boundaries of the argument will be smaller. If we're talking about in Europe, that's only 1% of the GDP. There, the arguments over the that percentage are very minor, not because the threats are minor, but because the budget is relatively small, and so the arguments are on a lower scale. When we reach a lower level of security defense spending, then the disagreements will also be lower, and unless we have a major event, and there, as I said, the wisdom of the statesman is very important in order to prevent such a thing from happening, we can reach a situation where the public debate will be at a lower scale. But we need security in order to have the economy. We need the economy in order to have security, because if we don't have security on a good level, the economy will not flourish, and if we don't have a good economy, there won't be resources for the security. So we have a kind of a Gordian knot here, connecting these two things, and despite that, everything kind of works quite well in light of the reality that we have been in the situation for many, many years. To sum up, I'll say the following. In the committee that I led, I can say that the cost of security in Israel has gone down to the lowest level ever in the state of Israel, and that's a good thing. And this has enabled the security to create what it created, especially as a result of increasing the product of the state of Israel to very high levels. We currently have more than a trillion, 100 billion shekels, which are very, very high figures in terms of the economy for Israel. And I think what we have proved is that we can create a multi-year program that backs up the multi-year program for the IDF. And this is something that needs to be taken into account, especially for the future, when there will be new plans. The subject of streamlining has been absorbed very strongly in the army, and that's a good thing. There are better mechanisms for the authorization of big projects, and that's a good thing too. I think that the economic awareness is much stronger today than it was in the past. Nevertheless, in the future too, whatever committee meets, ultimately the big decisions on the state budget will be a function of the political decisions made by the captains of state, first and foremost the Prime Minister. And I think the Minister of Finance should be taken into account very, very strongly in order to create the right balance between the economy and security. And the Prime Minister should have the biggest contribution to the wisdom of the statesman in order to prevent major events, which we believe that the effectiveness of preventing them, and this will also impact the security budget. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. I do believe, I am even convinced that the committee that you headed really placed the cornerstone for all the discussions that there were and will be on the security budget, and the future committees whose conclusions will be published after the elections cannot really deviate much from what you have outlined in your principles. I would now like Dr. Adi Brender from the Bank of Israel to speak. I just want to say that as a journalist, I remember that I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, the Ministry of Finance said that the security budget is 7 billion shekel higher than the Brodet committee recommendation, and so they came to the Bank of Israel to say who's right. And Adi said that the cost of security is about the same as the Brodet committees, and in fact deflated the entire argument. So Adi, please. Thank you very much and good afternoon. Since I am speaking after David Brodet, I will not again explain the principles of the committee that he headed. I will instead try to look forward to the future and see how we can build this outline of the security budget in preparation for the years to come. And most of what I will have to say will be dedicated to the various technical aspects associated with the empty half of the work of the committee, which is the advantages of the outline that the committee has put together that were not put in place because of various difficulties in the process and the way it was implemented, and I will try to present some thoughts on this matter. When we look at the system for deciding on the budget for the years to come, and most of the infrastructure was already, and the principles were already outlined by David, there are two ways to build a budget. The first one is bottom up, starting with a collection of plans that we think are desirable, whether it's in security or any other area, and to then go up, sum it up, and to say this is the budget that we need. And then the experience in the world has been that it's not really possible because each system sees various needs, and all those on the margins you can say something that's very good if you can only give us a little more money. And at the end of the day, when you make a budget and you look at systems, you need to start by dividing the pie, the budget pie, according to the goals that are to be achieved in the various areas, and as we've said, between the the civic needs and the security ones, and then to take the budget and make the most of it, whether it's for defense, security, whether it's for another area. The second part of the logic of such budgeting has to do with an argument, with a discussion that can be surprising but appears in public discussion, that when the level of income goes up, then more needs to be spent on security. Is there a correlation? Some say that security is a constant and it has nothing to do with the level of quality of life and the standard of living. And the public in Israel and in many other places in Israel believes there should be, some people say that people in Israel and elsewhere think that when they have better standard of living, they expect higher standards of security. When we were poor 20, 30, 40 years ago, we had certain expectations. When missiles were fired at us, it was then shells, it wasn't missiles. It seemed probable that we should go into shelters in Jerusalem for several days until the war ends, and nobody thought that it was improbable or implausible. And now when you go for 5 minutes into your shelter, the apartment shelter within your apartment, and they think it's an outrage that we don't have enough defense and enough security, and it's part of the process of the standard of living being higher. The second part has to do even more directly with the activity itself. When the the level of the product goes up, we need to defend more, because 1 hour of the economy not working costs less when the product is low than when the product is high, and therefore you need to pay more, it costs more to defend this standard of living and the level of activity when it goes up. So there is a correlation at the end of the day between a rise in the standard of living and the cost, how much you want to spend on security and how much you can. And the third thing, of course, is a correlation between how much you spend and how much you get. If you spend more on security, which of course again is an argument that is maybe surprising but exists, people say that when you spend more on security you don't really get more security. And I think that is something that, economically speaking, most people agree that at the end of the day, obviously, there is a correlation between the resources you spend and the product you get. Therefore, as a result, we need ultimately, when you build a security budget that is top-down, to build a system that links it to the standard of living in the economy, to the level of activity in the economy, and on the other hand also allows for the civil activity. And one of the greatest differences between security and other public services, as David Brodet has shown before, is that security is a public product, and therefore it has less of a link with the sector, with the population, the size of the population, whereas education, for instance, if you want to improve education, then you need to increase whatever you give per student, because the more resources are in the system, the higher the level of each student. Moreover, if you want to improve, you need to increase the cost per capita. In security, the product is public, and therefore you can create a distinction between the cost on security and the cost of other services, other public services, which is something like the size of the population, that allows you also to increase the cost of security as per the standard of living, and also to make it smaller vis-a-vis the product, because GDP is higher. So at the end of the day, that can bring us to several of the outcomes that we desire. I will list them shortly, but the principle of the matter is that when you build a security budget so that it increases pretty much the same as GDP, or the same the cost per capita, or the income per capita, then we need a system that will give us the following advantages. First of all, we need the security budget to grow over time in an expected manner, because mostly we can predict the growth of the population, and that is something that if the government sticks to it, then the cost is also a constant grows in a constant way. Also, the costs will go down both versus the budget and the population, because the budget will not increase, and also the stability that the defense, the security budget will get, the security itself will also get this stability, because we know exactly what is being spent on security. I wrote here, does that sound familiar? Because the video talked before, so obviously it sounds familiar, because it's pretty much what the Brodet committee talked about. As for the committee's recommendations, well, they don't have a very good reputation over the years, because from one year to another there was a farce about the security budget. But if you look until 2013 or 2012, which was the last year when the budget was in fact by this outline, then you see that the red lines and the blue lines, the actual cost and the cost derived from the Brodet outline that was established at the end of 2007, were quite close together. So, over the years, such an outline created certainty for the security budget, created the ability to increase it in a constant manner, and also created the possibility of building a civil budget accordingly. But the problem was that in each of those years, the actual budget was much lower than the actual budget, and therefore, when you go back to the Brodet outline from one year to the next, also created uncertainty within that year, the processes that did not take place until ultimately they decided that the budget will go back to the outline, and the system could not work with this uncertainty, and the national budget also suffered from the same similar uncertainty. So here we see the cost of security over time, which has been talked about already, and I will not elaborate upon. So the questions I now want to talk about in the last minute or so do not have to do with the technical difficulties, the technical failures that brought about this uncertainty, because as I've said, the outline itself really did take place as planned, but there was a lot of chaos within each year until the result was reached, and some of the factors that have led to this result have to do with processes that took place. The first was, who says what security is? The government at the end of the day gives a budget to the security system, to the Ministry of Defense, and says, with that, please give me the most security you can provide. And at that point, does the government get out of the game, leave the game, or does the government actually dictate what security is, and it has the right to tell the Ministry of Defense, now we have found gas out at sea, natural gas, it is now your role to also protect these gas fields. And as we've said, the security budget is set up top-down and not bottom-up, and therefore we need the resources in order to make sure the natural gas rigs are not being compromised. Or is it now the Ministry of Defense's role to say, you let us now decide what is security. You gave us the money, now let us decide what to do. So certain questions such as those infiltrating in the southern part of Israel, in the Negev, or protecting civil aircraft, civil airlines, and all sorts of other discussions that used to be at the front of the stage, but then created uncertainty until they reconvened each and every year, or converged each and every year. The last question, and I will end with it, is the matter of streamlining. It's a very complex matter because it's very tempting to say that the system should streamline. But streamlining is something that at the end of the day, if you really want to be serious about it, you need to define how it should be measured. And I have to say that in some of the meetings I have had with some of the people from the defense system, certainly after some time has passed, there have been heroic efforts made by the defense system to really streamline, both in terms of the administrative and the logistics and so forth. But if you all know the system, that's just a small change. In order to really talk about huge amounts of funds in terms of streamlining, you have to go into operative areas. Are we streamlining by closing down units, closing down quadrants, etc.? So that really is a problem, because streamlining at the end of the day means that for the same money you want to be more effective, or you want to be as effective with less money. And when you start going into these issues, somebody also has to be able to say at the end of the day, by closing this unit, have we really lessened security, or have we streamlined? And there has not been a judge determined, so to speak, and without doing that, without deciding who can decide whether it's been done, the next outlines we talk about should be more cautious in terms of streamlining, because this will otherwise it may lead to a detrimental effect on the multi-annual outline, which we want to obtain because of its advantages. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Adi. Easy job now. They even spoke so highly of the defense system, and I think that you should now give us more of a future, look towards the future about the budget in the new government. Okay. I won't talk too much about numbers either, like Adi didn't. I want to present to you how things should change. Can I just have less light in my face? How should things change in order to make a difference? Recently, we have undergone changes that are very significant, both regional and technological. They're very rapid changes in speeds that we have not experienced before. The discussion we are all aware of is whether the new solution to the new threats is cheaper or more expensive than the solution to the past threats. And when we compare a group of people under a village in a bunker and is launching all sorts of weapons, and we want to compare this group to a threat of a tank regime, of course a tank regiment that is the enemies, then we're talking about solutions to problems, but we have to remember that it's not correlative to the same noise and dust and smell it creates. Because when you analyze the costs well, and whoever has profoundly analyzed the cost of Operation Protective Edge and other operations, you can clearly see that any attempt to create with redundancy, Iron Dome and so forth, protection of our population, and on the other hand to use very precise innovations, very smart and very expensive solutions to protect against incidental damage, the combination of the two means a huge leap in costs. It is absolutely nothing that can be likened or compared to artillery, to tanks, or to bombs from aircraft. You can't compare the two. But I don't want to talk in the few minutes I have about how much a solution to a certain threat should cost, and whether the solutions to current threats are more expensive than years past. I want to focus on the differential between the changes, as a result of the changes that we are now undergoing. When you look at the main reason, the main cause of the defense system, it is protecting the sovereignty of Israel. And the main reason, the main thing we need to take care of is sovereignty and preserving it. And I'm not saying preserving and maintaining sovereignty over the next year, but also preparing for scenarios that can happen in 5, 7 or 12 years. I want to give you an example. I did already jump there. Okay. We're giving here a very short example. Take a look for a moment. We estimate the threat to us at something like about a 6 on the scale, and we need to build a solution, some sort of achievement, to budget it and to decide how to do so. Let us assume that we decide to budget something that is bigger than 6. It doesn't matter. I took 11 just as an example. If a budget will give us a certain intensity that is higher than 6, let's say 11, is it enough in order to provide us with what we want in order to maintain sovereignty? And I think that whoever has taken a basic course in statistics knows that this is not the only player. When we say, we know that expectancy is not the only factor, it is also variance. And when I showed you what I showed you up on the screen, we know that the weak can sometimes win over the strong, because when we look at Goliath, David and Goliath, we have many stories where the weak have actually overcome and won in the battle against the strong. So now look at the solution we need. We don't always have a solution that means completely maintaining Israeli sovereignty. We talked about other budgets that we also need to take care of, whether it's education or housing or medicine or anything else in health. Of course we can't do that, so we have no other choice but to define certain probabilities. Let's say, okay, we will maintain sovereignty, let's try to define it. So let's take an example like I put here up on the board. I'm willing to take a 3% risk and say I will provide you a 97% protection of sovereignty, and for that I can provide a solution. Just in order to explain this variance and why there is we see the difference here. It comes from different things. If you have a desire without an ability, or an ability without a desire, then it's not a threat. But it needs to have both things to be a threat, to have a desire and to have the ability. Two processes are now happening at the same time. The first process is the very rapid regional changes. These changes are creating a situation whereby our ability at present to predict, to understand, to know who our rival will be in 3, 6 or 9 years, it's very difficult, much more difficult than ever before. The variance has grown, and that is the biggest change regionally. But there has also been rapid movement in terms of technology, and we see it globally also in civil aspects. Technology is moving very rapidly, and here again we have a difficulty predicting. It's the abilities. When we talk about desires, when we talk about abilities, what will be the abilities? What will be the capabilities of my rival in 12 years' time? That is the problem with this variance. And this variance, in fact, increases substantially in recent times because of these two uncertainties. And when we look, it looks something like this. We are saying that the growth in uncertainty means that we are living the same expectancy in 6, but it is being compressed downwards. And why does that matter? Why do I care if it goes up or goes down a little bit? If the solution I talked about, something we need to achieve, was to maintain the sovereignty by 97%, then when we look here, we see that those 3% here have in fact grown. You see, when you look at the red part here, the area under it, to the right of the number 11, it has increased, even though the expectancy of strong and weak has not changed. So in fact we're saying that if the stronger is not weakened and if the weak is not strengthened, then the change in variance means that I can no longer meet my goal. Instead of 97% in my example, I'm down at 87. And if I want to go back to that achievement, that solution that I wanted to provide, and having understood that the impact of the rival, I can't go back to the third line, it's completely hexagenic to my decisions. In fact, I need this area underneath the red line be before the blue. So if I want to assume that what I want is hexagenic to what my rival wants. In fact, I need to increase my strength. I need to invest more money just to maintain the same thing I wanted to do before, the same solution, the same achievement. And I will just sum this up in one sentence. Having understood and assumed that we see the main achievement required as maintaining sovereignty, the regional changes we are currently undergoing, which have been much more rapid than before, and the technological changes that are much more quick than before, that are changing variants, are leading us to a situation whereby whoever wants to get the same result will have to put in more money. Thank you very much. Thank you. We're talking about 87% of maintaining sovereignty, but you don't mean 100% of sovereignty in 87% of the state of Israel, right? And the rest, will there be less sovereignty? I now want to ask some questions, much more basic questions, to our distinguished panel. People were asked in the video we saw before, where should the extra shekel be placed in terms of the budget? And I want to ask you the same question. If the producers of this video were to come across you on the street and would ask you, now there are 100 shekels, 1,000 shekels, 1 billion shekels in the budget that can go either to health, security or education, Mr. Brodet, where would you put this extra money? I don't know. I have to say I don't know, and I'll explain why. One person that needs to know is the government and the Prime Minister, because, yes, but what are your preferences? If I sum up what I said, I have said the following. The Prime Minister and the government are managing risks, political, security, economic and social risks. If the government were to manage the political risks at a certain level, it will allow more for the civil aspects. If it were to manage risks differently, it will allow for less. And that is why it's a package deal, and there are very strong interactions between these areas. And for this purpose, the person who needs to make the decision needs to have the information. And when I get there after March 17th, I'll tell you. Yes, but when you go vote on March 17th, that'll be one of the questions you'll need to answer yourself. Okay, then I will have to think about it. Okay, so the first is not giving us an answer. What are you going to say? I don't think that I will say anything new than what Mr. Brodet has said. I think that the decision to allocate resources is a decision of preferences, and it's what you do when you go and vote. It's what the government does. There's a balance between costs and outcomes, and I think that a government public decision on what money should be spent on is made of three things. The first question is, what do you want? And of course, here it's a matter of preference. The second question is, once the money is allocated to what we want to allocate it to, will the money really get there? Which is a second question always. Once we decide we want to allocate the money to a certain goal, such as education or security, at the end of the day, if we end up spending it there or spending it elsewhere, that's a question that needs to be answered. The third question is, once we have the money in the right place, will the system receiving the money will be able to use it and utilize it well for the purpose we intended. So everyone can decide for themselves through these parameters. At the end of the day, since we are talking about preference, the government needs to make the decision. I think that the decision that is pretty much agreed upon with a wide consensus in Israeli politics is that over time we need to reduce the cost of security in order to dedicate more resources to areas such as education and civil areas in general. And I think that in terms of the rate, of course, there is less of an agreement, and that is a matter of preference. Yes, please, you remind me of what was once said by the American president. Bring me economists on one hand and on the other.
I won't be evasive, and because David didn't answer, I'll answer twice. Once I'll give my reason, and once I'll explain the policy makers. I'll start with that. I'm sure you're all wondering, the policy makers made decisions. How can I say something different from them? I don't know how many of you have read Kalman and Tversky on the theory of value, on what they got the Nobel Prize. One of the most important things they said is that decision makers, when you have to compare between putting the money into something daily that brings day-to-day results, whether it's housing or education or health, and the prevention of a big event that could cause damage at low probability, according to his own personal for reasons, he will put more money on the day-to-day things than on preventing a big event. So in the name of the policymakers, I say that we would get a very clear answer. I have proof. Kalman and Tversky got a Nobel Prize for that distinction. They explain that the main reason is because the policymaker can't get into infinite detail. He can't do 100% of the testing, and ultimately the decisions that are made are from the gut, and that's why they go in that direction. So what should we do where the security budget is concerned? We have to tell the policymakers to collect more data and see what happens with the security budget. And somebody actually did that in 2009. His name is David Brodet. That committee did a very in-depth study and brought the data to the decision makers, the policy makers that appointed them. All the data were revealed to the government of Israel. And what happened? Another 100 billion shekels over the next 10 years were decided. Only 46 billion. Only 46. The committee decided on 30 billion came from internal streamlining. In other words, more money was received as a result of this. So if we were to put Kalman and Tversky in the room with the decision makers, they would put more money in. If you ask me, I think that there should be more money given to the security budget. I'm told that the discussion is over. I thank you. I just like to say one thing, that there is a very big gap between the perception of the media and some of the public regarding the security budget and the scholarly presentation that we heard here, which means that the media needs to learn more. Thank you very much.